Uh, Welcome to Harvard Law School Private Equity Roundtable organized by Harvard Association for Law and Business. My name is Vladimir Vasiljevac, and I teach courses on private equity here at the law school. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce David Rubenstein, the keynote speaker for today's roundtable, moderated by Heather Lee, who is co-president of HALB. David Rubenstein is, as you know, co-founder and co-executive chairman of the Carlyle Group, one of the world's largest and most successful investment firms with over $210 billion in assets under management. And before co-founding Carlyle in 1987, Mr. Rubenstein practiced law and served at White House for 14 years. Besides his tremendous success in his business career, he's equally known for his philanthropy. Mr. Rubenstein is chairman of the Boards of Trustees of the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, the Smithsonian Institution, and the Council on Foreign Relations, trustee of the National Gallery of Art, the University of Chicago, Memorial Sloan-Kettering Cancer Center, Johns Hopkins Medicine, Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts, the Institute for Advanced Study, the Brookings Institution, the World Economic Forum, and president of the Economic Club of Washington. Among many other philanthropic initiatives and awards, Mr. Rubenstein is an original signer of the Giving Pledge and a recipient of Carnegie Medal of Philanthropy and the Museum of Modern Art David Rockefeller Award. Mr. Rubenstein here at Harvard also gives through his positions as a fellow of the Harvard Corporation, as chairman of Harvard Global Advisory Council, and as a member of the Board of Dean's Advisors at HBS. Mr. Rubenstein is 1970 magna cum laude graduate of Duke University and 1973 graduate of the University of Chicago Law School, where he was also an editor of the Law Review. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Professor. And thank you, Mr. Rubenstein, for taking the time to be with us.
My pleasure to be here.
So I'd like to begin with how you grew up, the stories that molded you as a youth that brought you to where you are today.
Right.
So you grew up in a blue-collar neighborhood in Baltimore.
That's correct.
Your father was a postal worker.
That's correct.
Your mom worked in a dress shop.
That's right.
What were some of the stories from your youth that led you to become the self-made man that you are today?
Well, that'd be complicated. I'd have to be on a psychiatric couch to answer that appropriately, probably. But one of the great advantages in my life is that I grew up with no money. If you grow up with a great deal of money, as my children have, it's harder to be as highly motivated as when you grow up in a modest family. So my father made about $7,000 a year in the post office. I was their only child. Neither of my parents graduated from college or high school. So you have a sense that if you're going to get somewhere in the world, you have to do it on your own. And the result is you tend to work harder, and maybe you absorb learning more readily because you know you need to do well in school. So it's a big advantage, and I think the greatest thing that parents can give their children is unconditional love. So my parents supported me. They couldn't open doors for me. They couldn't get me jobs. They couldn't get me into schools. They couldn't do anything that would be the kind of thing that wealthy parents might today, leaving athletic teams aside, get you into school with or help you with. But in the end, it was a great advantage. So I got lucky and did okay in school, but I wasn't a superstar, and some of you may be superstars. There are people, some of you may be in this audience, who are these kind of people who, you're first in your class in high school, all-American athlete, first in your class in college, Rhodes Scholar, president of the Harvard Law Review, Supreme Court clerk, White House fellow, everything that you could possibly want. My experience is that, with some exceptions, those people don't actually do as well later in life because they often coast. So I divide life into three parts. The first third is when you can be a Rhodes Scholar, president of the Harvard Law Review, first in your class at Harvard Law School or the equivalent somewhere else. And the second third of life is when you're really getting your career underway, you kind of decide what you're really going to do. And the third third is where you're really, I won't say coasting, but you're reaping the benefits of what you have done in the second third. In the first third, if you are all those wonderful things I described, you might tend to just coast the rest of your life and not accomplish as much. So when I worked in the White House for President Carter, there was a person who went to Harvard College. He was in the administration. Harvard College, summa cum laude, president of the Harvard Crimson, Rhodes Scholar, PhD from Berkeley in economics, Yale Law School, editor-in-chief of Yale Law Journal, Supreme Court clerk. And when people saw this resume, they said, well, no point even interviewing the guy. Plus, he was, blonde hair, blue-eyed, great athlete, everything you'd want. I mean, say this is perfect. Every time he would get a job, people would say, you're too good for this job, we'll give you another job. And he got all these jobs after just 1 year at each thing. The result is when he got to be 45, he had not actually accomplished anything because he was just getting jobs based on his resume from when he was 20 or so. So the advantage of not having that kind of resume was I knew I had to work harder. And so the advantage of coming from a more modest background is you're more likely, I think, to accomplish things. And if you look at the people that have won Nobel Prizes as an indicator, they are almost always people who came from lower income families. Very rarely did somebody come from a billionaire family and they won a Nobel Prize. I haven't seen that happen yet.
So even though you said you were not an academic superstar in high school, you still won a scholarship to Duke University.
It wasn't a basketball scholarship, I assure you. It was not? I am a Zionist now. I love Zion Williamson, but I was not a great athlete either. In fact, I was the only person in Duke's history who got cut from an intramural basketball team. And there were only 4 other people on the team, so it's hard to do that. But I did get a scholarship, but it wasn't, I still had to work through college, and I still needed to have summer jobs. So I got enough to get through it, but it wasn't spectacular.
I see. You also went to University of Chicago Law School.
Well, I had intended to come to this law school, and but what happened was I applied to a lot of law schools, and I said whoever gave me the biggest scholarship, that's where I was going. So I was thinking I was coming here, and all of a sudden, University of Chicago said they had a program to give a full scholarship to certain students. I hadn't even heard of it. I'd never even been to Chicago, the city or the university. So I said, okay, a full scholarship is great. They said, send in your $50 and you reserve your place for your full scholarship. You come next year. Then they sent me another letter saying, send in your $50 and you reserve your place in a law school dorm if you want to live in a law school dorm. So I said, well, $50 was a lot of money to me then. So I said, well, using the course in logic that I had taken at Duke, if I send in the $50 to the law school dorm people, surely they'll tell the law school people I'm coming to get the scholarship. Why would I need a law school dorm if I'm not going to be in the law school? Well, that logic didn't really work. And so the first day I showed up at law school, I said, here I am, David Rubenstein, full scholarship recipient. They said, well, you didn't send in your $50. We gave that to somebody else. I said, well, I sent in the $50 to the law school dorm. Why would I need a law school dorm if I'm not coming here? They said, that's a completely separate department. We don't even know those people. And so I started to cry, saying my legal career is over. I thought I'd be on the Supreme Court. All these great things I was going to do. And finally, they didn't want anybody crying in the admissions office, I guess. So they said, okay, we'll give you the scholarship. So I was very grateful for them. I've now given them $45 million in scholarship money to make up for their gift. So, some of you, maybe some of you have been offered this. I have a program where I bribe people to go to the University of Chicago Law School. The best people every 20, I get 20 a year. So we have 60 people who are on full scholarships at University of Chicago. And it's designed to bribe people to maybe go there over some other law schools. Maybe any of you ever been bribed there or tempted? But anyway, they have a lot of people who are tempted to go, and bribery usually works, so they get some pretty good students who otherwise would probably go to Harvard.
And after you graduated from Chicago Law School, you went to work at the White House as the assistant to the president.
I did work in the White House. At
the White House, you were known for your Herculean work ethics. You were first to come, last to leave. What drove you to be such a workaholic? Well,
if you want to work in the White House, and I did, I had no interest in making money. I grew up in a poor family. I was interested only in giving back to society. John Kennedy gave this great speech when I was in 6th grade. He said, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And I wanted to help my country. I thought I could go in government politics. That would be what I could do. There were no hedge funds, private equity funds, tech startups in those days. If you wanted to practice law, you practiced law. If you wanted to be in business, you went to your family's company, or maybe you went to a large company like IBM, but there were no entrepreneurial kind of startups, so business wasn't quite as exciting, and I was only interested in helping my country. I had no interest in money at all. So I went to work at Paul Weiss after law school for a man named Ted Sorensen, who had written this great speech for John Kennedy that I just referred to, the great inaugural address. I thought some of his luster would rub off on me, and it didn't really. After a couple years of practicing at Paul Weiss, they said, well, you're not that good a lawyer, and maybe you should think of something else. And my clients said to me, you're really not cut out for this, so maybe you should do something else. So I got the hint that I should leave Paul Weiss, and I was hoping that Ted Sorensen would get me a job, and he got me a job ultimately with a man who he said was running for president, had a good chance. And I said, who is it? Jimmy Carter. I said, isn't he the peanut farmer in Georgia? He's no chance of being president of the United States. but I had nothing else to do, so I went to work for him. I joined Jimmy Carter when he was 33 points ahead of Gerald Ford in 1976 in the general election. And when I was finished with Carter, Carter won by 1 point. So Carter said, like, what was your contribution? I was way ahead before you showed up, and now I barely won. So I did that. I managed to get inflation to 19%, which is the highest we've had in 50 years. So nobody thought that that I'd done a good job. But I said we can't possibly lose the election because we're running against an old man who's such a fossil he can barely get out of the bed in the morning. He's 69 years old. Ronald Reagan. How can we lose to this old man? I was then 31. I'm now 69. So I'm the same age as Ronald Reagan was, and now it doesn't look quite as bad. But Reagan beat us. And some of you will have the same experience that I had. The people tell you how great you are. When I was in the White House, everybody wanted to lobby me. I had a lot of influence with the president. I'm going on Air Force One, Marine One, and Camp David. And people come and tell you how brilliant you are, how great you are, because they want something from you. And they always said, and by the way, if you ever want to leave, call me up. I said, well, I don't want to leave. I'm going to be in the second term of Carter. I'll be the senior domestic policy advisor, and I'll be very influential then. Really great. They said, well, okay, but if you change your mind, call me. Well, the day after we lost the election, I started calling all these people, and they didn't call back. And some of you may have this experience as well, where people tell you how great you are, and because they want something from you, but when you don't have what they want, then they don't give you anything. So I couldn't get them to call me back. I went back and practiced law again. And some of you will probably have this experience. You'll realize, despite your years of law school, if you're in law school here, you're not cut out for it. You don't like it as much as you thought. So I went back and practiced law after the White House. It was hard to get a job because nobody wanted a Carter White House aide. Finally, somebody felt sorry for me. They gave me a job. But I realized I was not very good at it. And you can't accomplish anything great if you don't like it, because you'll never manage the skills. So nobody, again, ever won a Nobel Prize by hating what they do or by doing it 9 to 5, 5 days a week. You have to love what you want to do and work around the clock really to accomplish something. And I just didn't do that in the practice of law. So I started my firm in 1987, and it became a large private equity firm. It enabled me to do a lot of the other things I've now done.
So let's talk about that a little bit more. The founding of the Carlyle Group in 1987. The industry was still very nascent at that time. Why did you choose to join the buyout industry? Why not venture or real estate?
Well, I was practicing law, not that successfully. Once again, my clients said, well, you're not that great a lawyer. Are you sure you really want to do this? And my partner said, well, you're not that great a lawyer. Why don't you try something else? So I was looking about something else to think about doing, and nobody wanted me to go back in government because Ronald Reagan was then in government, and he didn't want a Carter White House aide. So I read two things that changed my life, and you will all have this experience probably. You read something that registers in your brain, it changes your life. The two things were this. One, a man named Bill Simon, who had been Secretary of the Treasury in the Ford administration, left the Ford administration after Carter became president, and he went out and did something called a leveraged buyout. And he bought a company called Gibson Greeting Cards, and he put in roughly $1 million of his own money and made roughly $80 million in about 2.5 years. So I read about it in the early 80s. I said, wait a second. This guy made $80 million on 2 or 3 years of investment. He only put $1 million of his own money in. That's better than practicing law. But I didn't realize exactly what a leveraged buyout was, so I went down the street to Bill Miller, who had been Secretary of the Treasury in the Carter years, and said, your predecessor did a leveraged buyout. Maybe you could do one, and I can do your legal work for you as you're building this company. And he said, well, are you really that good a lawyer? I said, well, I'm a great lawyer. Of course, everybody knows that, but of course, he probably knew I wasn't a great lawyer. He ultimately decided not to do it. So I was thinking maybe I should start a leveraged buyout firm in Washington by myself, but I had no finance experience. So I recruited some people that had some finance experience in Washington, and I was hurrying to do it because of this reason. The second thing I read was this. I read that an entrepreneur will start his or her first company between the ages of 28 and 37 on average. There's always a Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg, but on average, an entrepreneur starts his or her first company between 28 and 37. And after 37, it's like a woman's biological time clock. Your chance of reproducing goes down after a certain age, and your chance of becoming an entrepreneur goes down after a certain age. Well, I read that when I was 37. So I said, uh-oh, if I don't do it now, I may never start a company. I'll be doomed to practice law the rest of my life. So I decided to do it. I recruited 3 people who had finance experience in Washington, and I did it in Washington because that's where I live. And I had a theory. Everett Dirksen, who was a former Senate minority leader in the 1960s, said, if you're getting out of town, get out in front and pretend you're leading a parade. Now, what does that mean? It means take advantage of the situation you find yourself in. You're getting kicked out of town, pretend you're leading a parade. So I'm saying, I'm in Washington, D.C. We understand companies more heavily affected by the federal government than those guys in New York. Now, that might have been true, it might not have been true, but it sounded good. So we were able to raise a little money around the idea that we would do investments in companies heavily affected by the government, and the deals tended to work out, so we built the business.
Let me ask you about a deal that brought you and the
Okay.
Carlyle Group to national attention. That was the $130 million purchase of the BDM International from Laurel in 1990.
okay.
What was it about that made it a deal that defined Carlyle Group 3 years
Okay.
after its foundation?
Well, we were doing a few deals from time to time, and they were okay, nothing spectacular. And then an opportunity came along to buy what is called in Washington a Beltway Bandit. Now, for all of you who don't know what that is, that's a kind of a company that services the Pentagon or services the federal government, but does a consulting firm, it does some work for the federal government that the government doesn't want to do itself. So one of the larger ones in the defense industry was something called BDM, stood for the founders, the last names were B, D, and M. And it was a good-sized company, and it had been acquired in effect by Ford Aerospace, and Ford Aerospace wanted to sell it for lots of reasons. So we tried to buy it, and I brought into the firm a former Secretary of Defense, Frank Carlucci, who had been Secretary of Defense under Ronald Reagan, so he had a lot of credibility in this area. We bought it, we made 6 times our money, and it gave us some credibility. And from that, we could go out and raise funds and build a real business. So it worked out.
And a lot of times at that period of your founding of the group, a lot of people identified you as a buyout defense firm
Right.
with deep sourcing connections in the government, DC.
Right.
Was that a fair characterization?
Well, there's an old saying that generals like to fight the last war. Some of you must have heard this. So I had brought in Frank Carlucci when we only had about 6 people in the firm. I brought in a former Secretary of Defense. I didn't really know him. He was in the Carter administration as the deputy CIA director, but I had never been involved with the CIA when I was in the Carter, so I didn't really know him. He was looking to come on corporate boards, but he wasn't a lawyer, didn't want to be in a part of a law firm, so he kind of was looking for a perch to hang out on, and he said he could work with us. He'd go on a lot of corporate boards. But he was able to call people as a former Secretary of Defense and get people on the phone. So 4 years later, when George Herbert Walker Bush lost the presidential election to Bill Clinton, I said, well, the same technique might work with people who are in the Bush administration. Let me go after the ultimate gold standard of people leaving the government, Jim Baker, former Secretary of State, former Secretary of Treasury, former Chief of Staff to Ronald Reagan. So I didn't know Baker, but somebody introduced me. Finally, after a few months, I convinced him to come. He said, can I bring my deputy, Dick Darman? Okay. And then he said later, can I bring my friend George Herbert Walker Bush, former president? I said, okay. And then George Herbert Walker Bush said, can I bring my friend John Major? I said, okay. So we had a former prime minister, former president of the United States, former Secretary of Defense, former Secretary of State, former head of OMB, and people said, hey, this is a government in exile. And it worked wonderfully for a while because people would want to see us. If you go to Kuwait to raise money and you take George Herbert Walker Bush with you, not that difficult to raise money in Kuwait with George Herbert Walker Bush. Or you go to Saudi Arabia with Jim Baker, not that hard. If your last name is Rubenstein, you probably wouldn't raise that much money normally, but you have Jim Baker with you, you'll probably be okay. When George W. Bush got elected, his father said, I can't be in business anymore, so I'm going to retire. Fine. But then after a couple of months, he got tired of being retired. He came back and said, I can still do some things with you. But then when the Iraq war went forward, we were blamed for it because we were seen as a government in exile. We were like the Bush administration, so we had all these former government people with us. So it kind of, you live by the sword, you die by the sword. It was very helpful in a while in giving us credibility, but then when the war in Iraq got blamed on us, it was harmful. So I had to retire all these people 1 week, and then I brought in Lou Gerstner, the former chairman of IBM and CEO of IBM, to be our chairman. So that was a technique that worked, but sometimes it didn't work perfectly towards the end.
Let me ask you about fundraising.
Yes.
So you have told people that you subscribe to Woody Allen's maxim that 80% of success comes from simply by showing up.
Right.
You travel nonstop around the world to meet with investors, often going to places like the Middle East where no PE manager have been before. Were you a natural fundraiser, or did you have to pick up some skills along the way?
When I started the firm, I thought buyouts mean you analyze a company, you do your due diligence, then you arrange the financing, then you do the oversight of the company, then you figure out how to exit it. And that's the basic business. It's different than it was 30 years ago. It's more intensive oversight of the companies and more value added. But essentially, look for companies, negotiate the deal if you can get it, finance the companies, oversee it, figure out how to exit and how to add value. Okay. But to do all that, you have to have money. So where does the money come from? It doesn't come from trees. So you can borrow money from banks for a leveraged buyout, but you got to actually have the equity. So where does the equity come from? Well, somebody has to go out and ask for it. So my partners all had MBAs and they were finance people. I didn't have an MBA and I didn't really understand finance that well at that time. So I said, okay, I'll do the job of going out and asking people for money. Now, I'd always associated fundraising with, kind of backslapping, beer drinking, suspender wearing kind of guys with slick back hair and, playing golf on the weekends and all that, none of which I did. So I wasn't sure I would be good at it because I was more mild-mannered and just kind of knew my brief, but I basically started with a concentric circle of friends, relatives, former friends, kind of acquaintances, and worked my way around the world. And I was willing to do it because the others didn't want to do it. It was necessary. And I kind of invented something that hadn't happened before. Historically, private equity firms were mom and pop operations. When KKR did the famous RJR deal in 1989, they only had 7 people in the firm. Why? Because the partnership agreements all said you can only have one fund at a time because all the people in the firm have to spend 100% of their time managing that fund, which makes sense. If you give money to people, you want them to spend their time managing this fund. I decided, as most entrepreneurs do, they kind of break the rules. And by definition, if you're an entrepreneur, you're doing something nobody else did before, and you're probably breaking rules. The rule that I broke was this. I said to my partners after I spent a few years finally helping them raise a $100 million fund, which is all I could raise, $100 million. I said, tell you what, you guys manage this buyout fund. I have an idea. I'm going to create a Fidelity or a Vanguard or a T. Rowe Price of private equity the way those people had done it in the mutual fund business, which is to say, have multiple funds, and you can say to people, you want to be in a buyout fund, we have that. You want to be in a growth capital fund, we have that. You want to be in a venture fund, we have that. You want to be in a real estate fund, we have that. You want to be in a distressed debt fund, we have that. And take advantage of our brand name, centralized fundraising, legal, tax, accounting, other administrative things in Washington, and then have these dedicated funds, all of which we would control the investment and oversight of. So people laughed at me, and people said I was a franchisor. I was like McDonald's selling out, franchises everywhere. But the truth is, I was creating these funds. It was a model that hadn't happened before. Others have, I think, done it probably better than we have now. But that was the model. And so to do that, I had a lot of funds, and to do that, I had to go out and raise money for these funds, perpetually. So I did it myself for a while, but then ultimately I built a gigantic fundraising operation because we were always in the market for something. The sun never set on a Carlyle fundraising effort. We were always raising money. And so I got to know people all over the world, and I was on the road for, 6 days a week, all over the world. So going everywhere. I knew more people in Abu Dhabi than I think I knew in my hometown of Baltimore. I was running around the world. So ultimately, I built a network of people. Now we have at Carlyle about 125 people in the fundraising effort. So, but that's what I did. I did it. And the Woody Allen line you referred to was a line that Woody Allen famously came up with years ago. Either, I can't remember, it's 80%, 85, or 90% of life just showing up. So what that really means is, if I want to raise money in Abu Dhabi, it's still this way. If I've been to Abu Dhabi 10 times in the last 3 years, and I know everybody in the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority or the Kuwait Investment Authority or any equivalent group, if I say to them, we have a new fund, you know all our people from the previous fund, you like the previous fund, I'll just do this by telephone and tell you the new fund, read the documents, and tell us how much you want to put in. Or maybe we'll do it by video. No. You got to show up. Show me that you love me. Show me that you really care. So fly to Abu Dhabi and do the meeting in person. So, I don't know whether it's really necessary to do it. In many ways, you can get the same information by not showing up, but people like you to show up, and it's like Woody Allen's phrase, if showing up is 80% of the effort, because it doesn't really add that much, but it gives you a personal sense that you really care.
Then other than by just showing up, how do you convince people to give you their money for you to keep for potentially 10 years or more?
Well, it's obviously not by charm and good looks, right? It's obviously something else. People give you their money because they trust you, they believe what you say, they think that they're going to get their money back and a profit. And I think that you develop trust over a period of time, so people will say, well, you've made money from before, you might make it again. My theory on having multiple funds was this: if you were in my buyout fund and you made money with me, if I come to you and say, I have a venture capital fund, you should say, logically, you know nothing about venture capital, so I'm not going to give you money, I'll give it to people that only do venture capital. But you say, well, you're honest, I like you, you guys treat me well, I'll give you a chance, and that was basically the leap of faith that people were willing to make. And I would say, in terms of fundraising, nobody here in this audience has gone to Harvard Law School or wherever you're in school and told your parents, you know what I want to do when I grow up? I want to be a fundraiser. Nobody says, I want to be a fundraiser. They want to be a lawyer, a judge, or a business person, or a private equity person. Nobody says, I've grown up to be a fundraiser. And why is that? Because people think that asking people for money is a little dirty, difficult, it's unseemly. I don't quite look at it that way. I maybe did years ago, but I basically say if you're selling something, you should be proud of it. And if you have something to sell that's good, why is it harmful to say to somebody, why don't you give me money and I'll invest it on your behalf and you'll get money back and a profit? Now, in life, you all will find that when you're out of school, if I were to ask the question of this audience when they're out of school, about 90% of their people will raise their hand when I ask these questions. One, what percentage of you have asked people for money in the last month for a business, philanthropic, or political activity? And the answer will be probably half people ask people for political contributions or for somebody, for a business venture, or for philanthropic activity. And what percentage of you have actually been asked for these kind of investments? You'll find that life is all about fundraising to some extent. We've become a perpetual fundraising machine in the Western world. People are always asking people for money. So I've gotten used to it, and I get asked for lots of money for charitable contributions. I ask people for charitable contributions, and people can say yes or no, but that's how the world really works. So it's not that difficult to ask people for money. I think if you have something to sell, you think it's good. In the investment world, if you have a track record that's good, people will keep giving you money until you don't have a track record that's good. And also helping, if you treat the investors well, you give them information, you treat them appropriately. If your record is not the best, they will probably give you some credence. But if your record is really, really good, you don't have to treat people quite as well, because people will beg to give you money.
Let me ask you about cyclicality. So you said about private equity back in 2006. This has been a golden age for our industry, but nothing continues to be golden forever. Right. So here we are 13 years later. Some people are saying that the music is slowing down. Is this a time to harvest, or are you and your team still out there buying more?
Well, in 2006, private equity, let me start back. The Earth itself is about 4.5 billion years old. Life on this Earth started about 3 billion years ago. Humans and our predecessors started maybe 3 million years ago, Cro-Magnon, Neanderthal. Homo sapiens, which all of us are about 400,000 years old. So just think about this. Of the 400,000 years that we've been on the face of Earth and our ancestors, 400,000 years, for 99.9% of that time, there was no private equity, amazingly. And for 99.9% of those 400,000 years, people didn't worry about having money invested on their behalf. If you're living in caves or you're barely, you're just subsistence, you're just trying to stay alive. When people were living in caves 400,000 years ago, the average life expectancy was 20. In fact, the life expectancy in the United States at 1900 was 49. So people were worried about three things: subsistence, shelter, and basically continuing the species, which is what all species really worry about: how to stay alive, how to keep the species alive, and how to stay alive by either sheltering themselves or having food. So for 99.9% of the time that humans have been on the face of the Earth, they didn't worry about investing money to get good returns. Probably in the Western world, I can't speak as well about the Eastern world, but in the Western world, probably around the 1600s, 1700s, a new concept arose. Some people could worry about things more than subsistence. They had a little extra money, and they didn't know what to do with it. So what did they do? They said, I'll give it to somebody else, and that person can give me more money back than I gave them. We'll call it investing. And so the first kind of investing was you gave people some money, they were banks, and they would give you back a fixed income amount. So you might charge, the bank might charge you a 1% fee to make it simple, and they would give you back 2% interest. And that was what a lot of money investing was around 1600s, 1700s. Then equity got invented, and you could give people money, and you might get an equity return, a higher risk, higher reward. And then stock exchanges came along, and then people ultimately did two things with their money when they invested it. They would basically give it to somebody for a fixed income return, maybe 1 or 2% per annum, or equity return 3 or 4 or 5% per annum. And then that's all there really was. And then private equity came along, and it came along, you could say Christopher Columbus invented it, because when he came over, he got Queen Isabella to give him a carried interest in the gold and the profits he realized, but there was no gold and profits in the end, so he never got a carried interest. But to be serious, after World War II, some people came up with the idea of starting a new industry. They called it adventure capital. They were people that came out of the technology part of the military. They wanted to start new companies. They called it adventure capital. And they asked people for three things that nobody had ever done before in money management. They said, one, we want you to commit a certain amount of money. We don't actually have any things to invest in yet. Commit to it. Two, we would like you to pay us a fee on the committed capital, okay? Even though we're not doing anything to invest in your money, you're still holding on to it. And three, we want 20% of the profits, the so-called carried interest. And that revolutionized money management, and that was the adventure capital business became the venture capital business ultimately. And then around the late 60s, early 70s, some people came up with the idea of what they originally called a bootstrap deal. You would get some money from people, you would borrow 99% of the purchase price, you put up 1% of the money as equity, and then you'd buy a company at a discount you thought to real value, make it a little bit better, sell it at a profit. So the early venture capital deals, the early leverage buyout deals called bootstrap deals, earned actually very high returns, not 1% and 2% or 4% and 5%, but 40%, 50%, 60% per annum in many cases. So people started rushing into the industry. So all of a sudden people rushed in, and then 1978, the Carter administration changed the law of the land that said that ERISA funds could invest under the prudent man rule in private equity, and therefore public pension funds and endowments started going into private equity. So the industry grew and grew and grew. Well, when things grow and grow and grow quickly, sometimes you have excesses, so you had your ups and downs and so forth. And around 2006, I thought the industry was growing enormously, and people were making lots of money, and I just thought, as Rubenstein, the former head of the Council of Economic Advisors under Nixon, said, if something can't keep going on forever, it won't. And so it just was going too well, and I said, at some point, this golden age will be over. And then 2007, 2008, 2009, we had the Great Recession, and things went down. But today, the industry has come back to the point where today there's roughly, I'd say, about $1.5 trillion of dry powder, $2.5 trillion in the ground investments, so $4 trillion in the industry. The industry is growing still fairly nicely because there's a perception in the world that we're going to have another recession at some point. And a very good anti-recession way to invest, people think, is investing in private equity, because it tends to not have to get mark to market every hour on the hour. Private equity people know how to add value in times of recession, and they tend to buy things cheaply in times of recession. So in the end, people are now increasing their allocation to private equity. So I don't know if I call it a post-golden age or platinum age, but industry is in very good shape, and it doesn't have the bad PR that it used to have when people call us locusts. It doesn't have people saying we're destroying the economy. It doesn't have people saying we're not paying, well, some people say we're not paying adequate taxes, but it doesn't have people saying we're destroying the environment, we're shipping jobs offshore. So many of the criticisms of the industry have abated, and I think the industry is generally considered an important part of the financial firmament in the United States and Western Europe.
Let me ask you about limited partners.
Okay.
Big investors have been pressing for lower fees. Some are asking for co-investment vehicles. Other investors, like Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, have built a small group of in-house managers. Given these pressures, where do you see the economic model of private equity going? So
the private equity firms, when I started Carlyle, there were 250 private equity firms in the entire world. Today, there are roughly 8,000. So it's been a growth industry. Why is that? Well, it's not, again, because of the charm and the good looks of the founders. It's because, in the end, if you can get 20% of the profits on somebody else's money, that is better than practicing law for whatever they get paid an hour. It's just, you're going to make more money doing that if you're reasonably good at it. And today, many people know how to add value. Many people are smart who go in the industry. So if you get 20% of the profits, if not 25% or higher on people's money, you're going to make a lot of money, plus 100% of the profits on your own money. Today, I'd say that the private equity world is at a point where people think well of the industry, as I mentioned, and they think that this will turn out to be a pretty good way to invest their money, I would say, over a longer period of time. I don't think that it's going to abate anytime soon. Returns are coming down, but investors are willing to take lower rates of return. They used to want 20% net internal rates of return. Today, they're happy with 13, 14% net internal rates of return. So I'd say I think the industry will probably do reasonably well for some time. It's not going to be, it's not as easy to make large sums as it was years ago because the industry is more mature, but I do think it's a pretty good industry, and it has the advantage of being a reasonably profitable business if you're reasonably good at it. I don't think the fees are going to go down all that much, and this is the reason. I think people recognize, to investors, that you get what you pay for in life. So if somebody says, I'll invest private equity money for you, I won't charge a fee, I won't charge a 20% carried interest, I'll just want a 1% fee if the profits are good, you get what you pay for in life. So people would say, if somebody's doing that, they must not be able to get 20% profits, and therefore maybe people don't think they're that good. I think that there was pressure on fees after the Great Recession, and the private equity people may have charged too many fees early on. We were charging deal fees, exit fees, entry fees, lots of management fees, keeping them all ourselves. Now it's changed. Basically, you make your money on your commitment fee, which may cover your costs, or you may have a little bit more than cover your costs. You get 20% of the profits above a preferred return. Today, you probably can't get a carried interest on a co-investment, but sometimes you can. Now, what you're referring to, the Ontario teachers, is this. Many private equity, many large endowments or national pension funds have said, well, I've looked at Rubenstein and Schwartzman and Kravis and Leon Black. They're all very handsome people, for sure, but I could probably do some of the things they do. So why don't I just have an in-house group at my organization, and I don't have to pay the 20% to Blackstone, Carlyle, KKR, or Apollo. We can do it ourselves, and we'll pay our people a little bit more than they would otherwise get, but not so much so that they're really getting the same compensation that we'd have to pay Carlyle. Some organizations can do that. In some pension funds, and like in Canada, it's not a terrible thing to let people make millions of dollars a year being a government employee. But in most parts of the world, certainly U.S. public pension funds, you would not be in a situation where an employee of a U.S. public pension fund could make $5 million or $10 million a year without causing enormous political problems. So I think in most parts of the world, it's not possible to retain great talent if you're not paying them large sums of money, and very few places in the world are doing that. So I don't think it's an existential threat to our industry.
You also have your own brand of philanthropy.
Right.
You have given a lot of money to the repairs of the Washington Monument, yes, the Monticello. You have made publicly available your collections of the Magna Carta, right, Declaration of Independence, the 13th Amendment. Why do you focus on these types of patriotic gifts?
Well, when you get wealthy, what are you going to do with your money? Okay, so you can buy a lot of artwork and yachts and planes and so forth. At some point, you realize, you don't need all that. So how many houses can you live in? How many works of art can you look at, and so forth? So throughout history, when people got very, very wealthy, they would spend a lot of money buying all these physical material things. And sometimes they would do what the ancient pharaohs did. They'd say, I like all these things I have. I'm going to be buried with it. And so bring it into the pyramids with me, and let me take this to the afterlife. There's no evidence you really need all these material things in the afterlife. So if you think about it, if you don't need all these material things in the afterlife, what are you going to do with money? So if I said to all of you today, I'll tell you what, you will laugh when I say this. Suppose I'm going to put you in Bill Gates' situation. I'm going to give each of you $100 billion. Do anything you want with it. Okay. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to go buy some art, a yacht, plane, houses, whatever you want, and then you've got 99.5 billion left. What are you going to do? 99.5 billion. What are you going to do? What are you going to do with that? Well, Bill Gates obviously studied it and decided he wanted to devote his life to healthcare in emerging markets and K-12 education in the United States principally. Most people who have large sums of money, they do these things. And throughout history, most people who have large sums of money, other than being buried with it like the pharaohs, what do? They do nothing with it except they give it to the next generation when they die. There's nothing wrong with that. In my case, I concluded that my children would be burdened by giving them each $1 billion. Now, they may not agree with that view, but I thought that probably it'd be better to do something else with it. So if you then say you don't want to give all your money to your children, and you don't want to, and you can say, all right, I'm going to give it to a charity or a philanthropic organization. But most people actually wait to do that till their deathbed. In other words, I'm amazed that so many people give away 99% of their wealth when they die. I say to myself, why not give it away while you're alive? You can see what's being done with it. Unless you're so certain you're going to be in a place where you can see where it's being done, I'm not certain I will be in that place. So I concluded that I should try to give away the money while I'm alive. And Bill Gates at that time called me and came to have lunch in my office, and he said, I'm starting a giving pledge. give away half your money when you're alive or upon your death, but you can, keep half if you want. I said, I'll tell you what, I'm going to give away all my money. And I just, I got lucky. I'm going to give it back to the country, made it possible. So I do what most people do. I give an enormous amount of money to educational institutions. I've served probably on more university boards than most people. So I served 12 years on the Duke board. I was the chair of the Duke board, 12 years on the Hopkins board, 12 years now on the University of Chicago board, and now I'm on the Harvard Corporation. So I've spent a lot of time giving money to educational institutions, and obviously if you're on these boards, they expect you to probably give some money if you're in a position to do so. And I give them a lot of money to medical research, as many people do, who have wealth. But I got lucky in one case. One time somebody asked me to go see the Magna Carta. It was on display. I didn't know why it was in New York, not in London. It turned out there are 17 extant copies, one in private hands that was owned by Ross Perot. He was putting it up for sale for whatever reason. I decided that I would buy it to keep it in the country. Of the 17 copies, 15 are in British institutions, one in the Australian Parliament. This was the only copy in private hands, the only one in the United States. And as all of you may know, if you know the history of our country a bit, the Magna Carta was the inspiration for the Declaration of Independence and for many of the people in our country revolting against England, because they said in our colonial charters, we have the rights of Englishmen, and those include the rights of the Magna Carta. So I thought one copy should stay here. So I bought the Magna Carta, I put it on permanent display at the National Archives. So then other people started saying, well, why don't you buy copies of the Emancipation Proclamation, the Declaration of Independence? And I started doing that and put them on display where people could see these copies, maybe be inspired to learn more about the history of it. Then the Washington Monument had earthquake damage. I decided to put up the money to fix it. And Monticello had problems, Montpelier, Mount Vernon. And I started fixing these places. And I ultimately decided that what I was trying to do was remind people of our history, because people know so little about our history. We don't teach American history very much anymore. We don't teach civics that much anymore. Today, it's hard to believe, but 10% of Americans who are college graduates think that Judge Judy is on the United States Supreme Court, which is not yet the case. So people know so little about our history. Actually, it turns out 3/4 of Americans cannot name the 3 branches of government. 3/4 of Americans cannot name the 3 branches of government. So it's a sad situation. So by having these things in American history, I kind of do something I call patriotic philanthropy, reminding people of the history and heritage of our country. And I started one program to educate members of Congress about history, where every once a month for the last 6 years, I interview a great American historian about American history in front of only members of Congress. It's a dinner I host at the Library of Congress. Doris Kearns Goodwin, David McCullough, John Meacham. A book with some of the best interviews is coming out in October. It's called The American Story that I've written. One of them was by somebody who was not a historian, but who wanted to be. His name is John Roberts. All of you probably know him. He's a graduate of the Harvard Law School, distinguished graduate, Chief Justice of the United States. I am the chairman of the Smithsonian now, and he's the chancellor, so we work closely together. So I interviewed him in front of members of Congress, because members of Congress don't really know the Chief Justice that well. And so I said to him, well, this is about history generally, and but we can talk about the law. And he said, fine. I said, by the way, did you always want to be a judge? And he said, well, I had no interest in being a judge. Oh, did you always want to be a lawyer? No, I had no interest in being a lawyer. Did you always want to go to Harvard Law School? I had no interest in going to Harvard Law School. So what did you want to do? He said, I wanted to be a historian. I cared about history more than anything else. I thought it was a great way I could spend time in the library. I loved history, okay, and write books about it. And my father said, John Roberts told me in this interview, that you won't make any money as a historian. It's very boring, and nobody's going to read your books, and you sure you can, support a family as a historian. John Roberts said, well, I don't really know. I'm not sure, but I really want to be a historian. Okay, his father said, all right, do what you want. Goes to Harvard College, and he majors in history. At the end of his sophomore year, he's coming back from Indiana, summer break or spring break. He gets off at Logan Airport, off the plane, gets in a taxi, and says to the taxi driver, take me to Harvard. He said, oh, are you a student there? Yes, I am. What are you studying there? Studying history. Taxi driver said, well, that's what I studied at Harvard as well, history. And John Roberts said, well, geez, maybe this is not the right profession for me. So he ultimately went to Harvard Law School. But anyway, okay. So I came up with the concept of patriotic philanthropy to kind of just say I wanted to give back to the country, and I'm trying to remind people about our history, and on the theory that if they learn more about history, we won't make some of the mistakes we've made already.
Great. So before I ask my last question,
Yes.
I want to give a heads up to the students that we'll open up the floor for questions pretty soon. And there are 2 microphones on the either side of the aisle, and you can come up and ask questions.
Okay.
So my last question is, what's the next big challenge for you? What's next for you?
Well, I'm 69 years old, so when you get to be 69, the biggest challenge is staying alive. My law school classmates are generally being retired from these law firms, generally retire you by a certain age now, so none of you are thinking about this, but generally law firms kind of say by 65 or something like that you have to retire. Accounting firms retire you at 60. So my theory is that when people retire you and you don't have anything to do, your brain can atrophy, your body can atrophy, and I notice a lot of people retire early, they drop dead. So I'm just kind of keep going, I'm trying to keep as active and get as many things done before my brain collapses or my body collapses. So none of you are worried about this, you're all young, but I'm trying to get as much done. So I call what I'm doing, I'm writing an autobiography now, it's called Sprinting to the Finish Line. I'm trying to get as much done before it's over. So as you was pointed out in the introduction, I now spend half my time at Carlyle. I have a family office in New York where I invest things outside of Carlyle, and a good-sized team doing that in venture growth capital things. And then I chair the Kennedy Center, which the Performing Arts area center in Washington, and I chair the Smithsonian, and I chair the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Economic Club of Washington. And I have a TV show where I interview prominent people. Some of you may have seen it. It's called the immodestly named David Rubenstein Show. It's on Bloomberg TV. I told them, don't name it after me. It's not a good thing to have a name called the David Rubenstein Show. A long ethnic Jewish name was not going to work. And Mike Bloomberg said, no, I don't think that's right. I think it'll work. So anyway, I do that, and then I have a lot of other programs where I'm trying to promote history, and I'm very involved in a lot of philanthropic efforts, and I serve on a number of boards, and so I've got a couple books coming out, and so I'm trying to keep busy, and my next biggest challenge, I guess, is just staying healthy to get this, get all these things done before basically it's too late.
Great, thank you. And with that, we would like to open up the floor for some audience
all right,
questions.
Questions?
If you could please come up. There's
you have a mic,
microphones
or
at either
here's
side.
a question. Right.
Hi, thank you. You mentioned that at least at the beginning of your career at Carlyle, you were responsible for fundraising, while some of your MBA friends were responsible for the finance aspects of the business. I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit more about that. When you're out there fundraising for a fund, aren't investors asking you specific questions about the fund strategies and things like that?
Okay. In the early days of fundraising, I could go out and say, this is our track record, and I would talk to them about the firm and so forth. Today, because people are so intent on due diligence, they will say, okay, we've heard your story, Mr. Rubenstein. Great, we like you, we know you. Bring in the people who are actually running the fund. So you have to do that, but if I took all the people or my successors who are doing fundraising, if I took, or they took, the people running the funds to every single meeting, the people wouldn't have any time to run the fund. So you basically try to narrow it down to figure out who's interested in having a serious discussion, and then you can trot out the actual deal team. So a fundraiser today, I can go to some people who've been investing with me for 30 years, and I say, this is a great fund, I'm putting a lot of my own money into it. They would say, okay, I trust you. But that's true of individual investors, family offices to some extent. But if you have large institutional investors that have fiduciary responsibilities to large numbers of people, they always need to have a gatekeeper, consultant, and they need to do a lot more due diligence. But what you say is generally right in the sense that you need to have the deal teams actually in front of the people who have the money.
Thank you.
Okay?
And we'll alternate and take questions from this side.
Thank you. On a personal note, making a lot of money has admittedly lost some of its attraction to us as a generation who grew up with a lot more like advantages than maybe our parents did. So what are the implications that you see for high commitment jobs
The question is what?
What are the implications that you see for high commitment jobs like in private equity? And secondly, what is your advice for us as a generation to prioritize the many opportunities that we have?
Okay. What was the question?
So our generation is less interested in making money than perhaps our parents' generations. Given this, what would you think is the attraction of some jobs like private equity where people are making a lot of money?
Well, every generation, is somewhat different, and generally younger people are probably not as focused on the making of money as saving the world and other kinds of things that would be nice. Generally, though, we find that people, if they get married, they have families, they have children, they tend to focus on the same things that previous generations have done. So at the early ages, when you don't have maybe as many responsibilities, you can focus on ESG-related concerns or environmental concerns, and there's nothing wrong with that, and we worry about that as well. I don't think that people necessarily have to go make money to be happy. There's no evidence that the happiest people in the world are the wealthiest people. It's maybe the opposite. Some of the most miserable people in the world are the wealthiest people I know. So they doesn't necessarily buy you wealth. But I do think that if you make money, you can do things with it that can make the world a slightly better place through philanthropy and so forth. But there's no evidence that the people that don't have money aren't able to also have a favorable impact in the world. Many people have done great things with having no money. Ralph Nader, done a lot of things having no money. A lot of people can be social activists or do great things without money. I'm not telling people that this is the only thing they should do, but it does have the advantage that you can be well compensated, as you can in being a tech startup that's successful, and then you have the freedom to do what you want. And freedom is a wonderful thing if you can not have to worry about money every day.
Thank you so much for being here, Mr. Rubenstein, and thank you for everything you're doing for Duke and for the world. I was hoping to learn more about Declaration Capital and the strategy. You mentioned venture, you mentioned growth. I'm also very curious about especially this idea of taking capital from outside sources and how limited partners of Carlyle might view such efforts.
Who asked you to ask that question? No, I'm just that's a tricky, complicated situation. Let me explain. I didn't have a family office. Many of my peers who started private equity firms made a lot of money, and ultimately they decided that they wanted to diversify, not put all their money in their Carlyle, in their Apollo funds or KKR funds or Blackstone funds, whatever it might be. I didn't do that, but then eventually people kept saying, "How come you don't have a family office?" So I got what I call family office envy. Everybody had a family office but me, so I said, I'm going to start a family office so people won't be able to ask me if I have a family office anymore, and I say no. So I started one, and I'm looking at things. This is my money. I committed a large amount of my money to it. It's deals that Carlyle wouldn't do. Every deal has to be approved by Carlyle. It's not a conflict and so forth. But Carlyle's not going to do some venture deals or some seed capital deals or some growth capital deals in certain industries. So I've been putting money into it. If I went out and raised money to supplement what I have, I'd have to get it approved by Carlyle, and it presumably would have to be investors that are not Carlyle investors or something like that. But there are a lot of families that don't want to invest in large private equity firms, but will invest alongside another family office. So I haven't had to address that directly, but the limited partners who invest with Carlyle, they don't have any problem with my investing some money outside of Carlyle, because everybody understands the diversification principle. So people at Carlyle, people who invest with Carlyle, they're not going to be upset that I'm investing some money in things that Carlyle doesn't do. That hasn't been a big issue. It may be a bigger issue if I go out and raise money for my family office, and I have to really be careful when I'm not competing with Carlyle for deals or for investors.
Hey, thanks a lot, David, for sharing your experience with us. I had two quick questions. One is wanted to get your thoughts on how do you see technology impacting the private equity industry and the broader investment industry in general? And the second question is, given your unique perspective across business and political backgrounds, what's your take on the China-US relationship going forward for the next decade or two?
The China-USA relationship?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
On technology, historically in the buyout world, people laughed at the idea that you could do a technology buyout, because people say technology changes so quickly. So if you're holding something for 5 years, the technology could be obsolete, and so you're stuck with an obsolete company. So for many years, the general wisdom, conventional wisdom, was technology buyouts don't work. Then a firm named Silver Lake got started, and they did a couple technology deals that did extremely well. And people said, well, maybe that's not so true. Maybe you can, if you know what you're doing, do some technology buyouts, and they can work if you know what you're doing. And then other people began to notice and say, well, if Silver Lake can do it, we can do it. And so now you see an enormous number of buyout deals being done in technology. In fact, Carlyle probably has, in 1 year, I think maybe last year, maybe 50% of our deals were technology related, kind of buyouts. And so I think buyouts are increasingly done in the technology industry, and there are three aspects of technology. One is, can technology help you analyze a deal better than another deal? Artificial intelligence hasn't yet come full circle so that it can really help people analyze whether a company is going to be a good deal to buy or not, but at some point it probably will. Secondly, the companies we buy, increasingly we make them more efficient by giving them better technology and better access to better technology, and then the companies we buy may themselves be technology companies. So technology is increasingly important, and as one of my partners said recently, every deal today is a technology deal, every deal. In terms of the U.S.-China relationship, it's the most important bilateral relationship in the world. Carlyle is a gigantic investor in China. I go there 4, 5, 6 times a year. We've got a large percentage of our workforce doing deals in China. It's the best place in the world to invest other than the United States, in my view. The U.S.-China relationship has, as all of you probably know, Graham Allison has written a book, The Thucydides Trap, where he basically says that rising powers like China ultimately go to war with, in most cases, with the presiding power. I don't think that will happen in this case, but there's no doubt that China and the United States have the same relationship the two most important economic powers have for every generation, which is they're going to clash with each other. President Trump has brought this to the head by trying to negotiate a deal on trade and tariffs and other technology-related things. I think he will get a deal done. It's not going to solve all the problems. The enforcement's going to be complicated. But I do think the U.S.-China relationship will always be complicated as long as you have the two most powerful economies in the world, because they're all competing for customers and other advantages. I think that the trade deal with China will get announced sometime soon, to be my guess, as the President has said, and I suspect it will be reasonably well received by the markets, but it won't be perfect.
I want to be mindful of Mr. Rubenstein's schedule, so we have time for one last question.
One more question, okay.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Quick question. So for the lawyers in the room, what is your advice as to how we should approach our legal careers in the law firms, and especially what skills should we cultivate in the law firms to become helpful and effective PE fund advisors?
Well, people call me all the time who are lawyers and say, how do I get out of the legal world and go into the private equity world? If you love the legal world and you like it and you like what lawyers do, and you're good at it, I don't think there's anything wrong with being a lawyer. I think it's a very good profession. There's no doubt, unless you're a plaintiff's lawyer and you're one of the most successful plaintiff's lawyers in the country, you're not going to make the kind of money you can if you're a very successful private equity person, but money doesn't mean it's not necessarily a sign of success. I think people who want to get out of the legal world and get in the private equity world, I tell them, practice law for a few years, corporate law probably helps more than litigation. Practice for a while. Use your law degree. My son is a JD MBA candidate at Stanford, and he doesn't intend to practice law. He wants to go into a different area of business. But I think a law degree is very helpful to him, as I told him for a long time. I think if you practice law, you'll inevitably make contacts that will lead to maybe somebody making you an offer to go work in a private equity firm. The transition's not easy, but it's more easily done when you're younger. The skills that are useful, the same skills that I think are useful all throughout professional life. Number one, hard work. Number two, perseverance, not taking no for an answer. Number three, learning how to write well, learning how to communicate orally well, learning how to lead by example or being an effective leader, being ethical, learning how to get along with people and share the credit, learning how to be humble and have some humility and not arrogance, and also, I guess, learning how to use the money that you're going to make and have a reasonable purpose for the money you're going to make and do something useful with it and have reasonably good outside interest in a balanced life. But I think as a young lawyer, I would just say learn the skill set and learn how to write well, learn how to get along with people, learn how to share the credit, and ultimately, something probably good will happen.
Well, with that, thank you so much, Mr. Rubenstein. This has been extraordinary.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you very much.